Hey, it's Danny Pellegrino from Everything Iconic. Ready to upgrade your style game without blowing your budget? Check out Quince. They've got all the good stuff, shirts and polos, activewear, and fine leather goods, all at 50 to 80% less than other high-end brands. And the best part? They're all about safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. Get that luxury vibe without the luxury price tag. Hit up quince.com/upgrade for free shipping and 365-day returns on your next order. That's quince.com/upgrade.
Hiring for your small business? If you're not looking for professionals on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. That's like looking for your car keys in a fish tank. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't even visit other leading job sites. So start looking in the right place. With LinkedIn, you can hire professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Since 2013, Bombas has donated over 100 million socks, underwear, and T-shirts to those facing homelessness. If we counted those on air, this ad would last over 1,157 days. But if we counted the time it takes to make a donation possible, it would take just a few clicks. Because every time you make a purchase, Bombas donates an item to someone who needs it.
Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
Before we begin, this podcast is brought to you by the generosity of my Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the content and can spare something to contribute to the cost of running the podcast, you can become a supporter or make a one-off tip via the links in the description. Every penny gets reinvested into improving the content of the show. I love putting these episodes together for you, but production comes with costs attached to it, and if I'm going to grow this and take it to the next level, I do need your help. If you can't contribute or aren't keen, I totally understand. But for those who can and are inclined, you know how grateful I am. Either way, remember to drop a like and leave a review, and enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to the Napoleon Assist. I reckon you're going to need to get yourself a cup of cocoa, your comfy slippers, some marshmallows, and a nice armchair for this one, because I am joined by Josh Provan, the wonderfully knowledgeable master of adventures in Historyland and author of Bullock's Grain and Good Madeira, which is available to buy, if you haven't bought it already, from helion.co.uk. Josh, brilliant to have you on. Enlighten our guests about why I've pulled you onto the Napoleon Assist yet again.
Well, apart from my sparkling personality,
obviously,
I presume it's because that we did 2 episodes, rather long episodes, about Napoleon's marshals in Spain. You know, Napoleon's boys on a Spanish road trip. What could go wrong? And
many things, it turned out.
As it turned out, many things could go wrong, but we didn't do anything for the British, for the Duke of Wellington's. What was Wellington's boys doing in Spain?
Absolutely. So having done Boney's boys in Spain, we're now doing Nosey's boys in Spain. Let's just dive straight in, shall we? We need to kind of deal with the elephant in the room, I suppose. I want today to focus on those who, to a greater or lesser extent, have been overshadowed by Wellington in his career, but without being rude to the Duke and not suggesting that he had a weight problem or anything. He is the elephant in the room. So quite quickly, what are your thoughts on Wellington as a command and also as a commander?
Okay. Asking me to talk about the Duke of Wellington is always, in a succinct form, is very dangerous, but nevertheless. The Duke of Wellington was a great man. Put it just like that. That could be the end of the answer. But let's go with the late Richard Holmes, how he summed it up at the beginning of his biography, The Iron Duke. He summed it up by likening him to a painting. The closer you got, the more cracks showed. He said that he was not always good, but he was unquestionably great. And he tried, like we all do, in our own ways, to be a good man where he could. And I tend to leave it at that, to be honest, in terms of my opinion of him as a human. As a commander, he was undoubtedly the outstanding military mind of the of the British Army in the 19th century, and he ranks high amongst the great captains of Europe as well.
Daring to just pull the leg of Cult Napoleon, better than Napoleon? Question mark. Heavily emphasized.
I mean, one of the things we do on history social media is, rank the generals in an endless cycle of, methodology and what ifs and assigning different categories of how this would happen if that didn't happen and things like that. And unfortunately, I mean, for content, I should just outright say, yes, of course, the Duke of Wellington was better than Napoleon. But in terms of talking history through principles, you cannot say one general is better than another all the time. All that we can say is that the Duke of Wellington fought Napoleon in one battle, and in that battle, he emerged the victor. You may derive from that what you will.
Yes, it's not entirely a fair reflection on either of them, though, is it? Because
no.
Napoleon, a long, long way from his best in 1815. I mean, apart from the concept behind the campaign, a long way from his best. And then Waterloo was a coalition victory. I almost question, you can't call it Wellington's victory any more than you can call it Blucher's victory, because it's both of their victories. It's that plan. We have, however, gone down the rabbit hole. Although what I will say is that I agree with you with that. And I would go so far as to say that on Napoleon's best day, he shines brighter than Wellington on his best day, which, as far as I'm concerned, is Salamanca.
Yeah, the glamour of Napoleon, the brilliance of Austerlitz and things like that, does seem to be shinier than Wellington. But then again, that was Wellington all around, wasn't it?
It was. Very different styles, which I think is part of the reason. But we've started talking about Wellington again, and we're really not supposed to. There should be a sort of equivalent of a swear jar every time we get distracted into talking about the Duke. We'd make a fortune by the end of it, seriously. The focus of today's episode, though, is the divisional commanders. Now, for some, and I'm thinking here about how the role of the division changes across time. We see the sort of murmurings of corps systems that have begun earlier in the period are then really brought to the fore by Napoleon and his way of manipulating them. Divisions, people might not be familiar because the structures change, they vary between nationality. So talk us through a division. What was it? I know that seems quite simplistic, but hey, you're here to enlighten us, and I'm sure you will do. But then also, what's expected of an officer commanding such a unit?
Okay. Division was a temporary grouping of several brigades. In Britain, there was no permanent formation above a regiment, and as such, at the beginning of a campaign, commanding generals in the field would arrange their battalions into brigades. So you have 4 battalions is the rule of thumb, depending how many battalions you have available. 4 battalions ideally make up a brigade, and 3 to 4 brigades make up a division. In the British Army, major generals commanded brigades, or if none were available, then the senior colonel or lieutenant colonel would do service. Wellington envisaged that lieutenant generals would command his divisions, so officers that would usually command army groups. And this gives you a little idea of what he thought that his divisions would act like. However, he never had enough lieutenant generals, and so you would get just the senior major general of whichever brigade was highest in seniority, commanding that division. And irrespective of that, divisional commanders, therefore, if we're talking about what is expected of a divisional commander, we'll look back at why Wellington wanted lieutenant generals. So he's wanting essentially guys who can command, who are used to organizing large formations of troops, essentially men who are used to independent command, even though he wasn't exactly good at long leashes or anything like that. But so that's a big thing. A guy who is confident enough and experienced enough in commanding large groups. And of course, they have to be tactically adept. They have to be able to fight in a battle. They have to know how battles work. They have to know how to get troops around a battlefield. Strategic sensibility was not necessarily a requirement, though, despite the fact he wanted quite high-ranking officers to do this. Because, as I just said before, Wellington had direct command over the divisions, except for the detached ones, such as Hill's, and later in 1813-40 in the army, broke into an effective corps structure. And indeed, before that, actually, in 1810-1811, Graham and Hill were already operating as commanders of at least 2 divisions, plus allied brigades. But because Wellington had direct control over the divisions, they didn't need to worry so much about doing, say, what Napoleon's marshals did. And so sort of, you go over here with masses of men, your own little army, go instigate a fight, and I'll come in and we'll crush them all together. Wellington's system of organizing the army around these divisions was that in miniature scale, and one that he had very tight control over. So you're looking at very brave men. You know, high senior officer casualties are not unusual in Wellington's army. Most of them got wounded at some point. You're looking at intelligent men, hopefully, guys who can at least organize and feed their troops, get them from one place to another, and you know, fighting ability. And those are the 3 main important things you're looking at in a divisional commander.
Yeah, as you say, Wellington not known as a delegator. He's not somebody who just says, here's a task, go make it happen, which you could argue sits in contrast to Napoleon in some respects, but let's not get drawn too deeply into that comparison. And as you say, I'm glad you draw the distinction between what the commander of a corps has to do, because they are very different things. As you say, the ability to administer, the ability to follow orders, highly valued, and failure to do that would have and did invoke some pretty stern rebukes. We'll get to Crawford and talking about how Wellington was damn crusty after the action on the Coa. But independence of thought, taking the initiative, was not necessarily something that Wellington valued, partly because of the potential for it to go wrong, partly because Wellington had the plan in his head and didn't really want other people to mess up his perfectly laid plan, even though there was flexibility within the plan, because he was aware of, you know, that whole thing of no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Wellington knew what he wanted, and he knew the way in which he saw it unfolding. And so to have somebody mess that up didn't usually go down particularly well.
No, it didn't. And this is a classic thing about Wellington's system of command. It's the just do what I tell you, for heaven's sake, basically. And he had there's that famous thing he said about his generals were heroes so long as he was there to command them, but were children as soon as he quit the field. That's how he felt about most of the officers that came under his eye. It's interesting that he didn't have a lot of choice as well, unlike Napoleon, about who he got. He was only able to actually ask for, I think, 7 or 8 of the divisional commanders or generals that he had under his command. And it was all really horse guards. You're not talking about Wellington's generals, you're talking about the King's generals. And so he could get given anybody, and he was very upset about some of the people he got, like Erskine, who he said, well, isn't he mad? And then Torrens went, well, he's a little mad, but he's okay at the moment, and I'm sure he won't go mad during this campaign. He's very clever when he's sane. And Wellington was fine. You couldn't do anything about it.
No, it's. I find, and this is an interesting thing, and again, we're going down the Wellington rabbit hole, but this is important, that Wellington is deeply invested in this whole ancien regime system. He's a product of it. He doesn't believe in substantial reform to the old ways, but he does find himself frustrated by that old system in that inability to promote officers who he considers worthy. And as you say, the restrictions that it places, not least because for a good chunk of this conflict, Wellington's a bit too junior. He's actually operating above his pay grade in some respects, but his ability to generate results is what enables him to request more men, and ultimately he's commanding really a bigger force than perhaps he should have done ordinarily in his career. But there was no way, once he started getting results, that somebody was going to supersede him. They'd done that, and Convention of Sintra had happened, and that didn't go down well. So we're not going back there again. What are your thoughts on Wellington as somebody who's got to engage with the system, and whether or not he really likes it?
This is Wellington, like you say, was some sort of part of the ancien regime system, right? That I don't think can be argued. He is, however, a part of it. However, to say that is to assume that there was no liberal movement within that system. I believe Jeremy Black did a talk recently about where he spoke about the fact that actually the ancien regime was in some ways much more liberal than the conservative sort of constitutional regimes that came after the Napoleonic Wars. And Wellington was one of these sort of, he was a child of he was a product of the ancient regime, but he was also a product of the Enlightenment. And so he understood what was going on, and he wasn't exactly, although he was dead set against parliamentary reform, he was not unimpressed by the idea that you could make things work within the system. He did feel like you could use this system in a more liberal way, despite being a conservative, which sounds very strange. Nevertheless, the system, which is a long way around of saying that the system is interacted with by everybody who took part in it, because that was what was there. That was how you got on in life. It wasn't necessarily that anybody liked it. People who went through the system and succeeded thought, well, it worked well for me. What's wrong with continuing that way? This obviously negates its flaws and its problems, but nevertheless, I doubt he really had very strong feelings on the matter. When his military career was over, he took the stance that it did work, could be made to work, and therefore, why fix it? The fact that after the rank of colonel, everything happened by seniority. So you would, if you lived long enough, become a general, is one of the things that Wellington actually did have to deal with as a problematic issue, because that meant the generals available to him in Spain were mostly all very old. And the only way horse guards could get a promising younger general, a promising younger field officer to become a general, is to en masse promote everybody ahead of them, therefore making them next in seniority to become a major general. So, and this happened in 1813 and 14, where you had up to 82 generals of major general's rank being made lieutenant generals, so some other guy can become a major general faster. And this is the way the hokey way the system works. It was a weird kind of fix it as you go thing, and it could allow for very rapid promotion for very talented individuals if they had the connections to make it happen. But whether and obviously he had very good connections and it worked really well for him, so he really had nothing to complain about until he wanted specific men to come into command. So I think, as with most things with Wellington, he liked it sometimes and sometimes he hated it.
That's very well said. It always strikes me that he's fine with the system up until the point where it's not working for him. and then he's got plenty to say about what's not good about it. And these are things that kind of bubble the whole way through. But that's perhaps a discussion for another day, the challenges that he's facing over the course of his career. Let's talk about people, though. Foremost amongst Wellington's visual commanders are, of course, people like Rowland Hill, Thomas Picton, and Black Bob Crawford. We'll cover some less famous individuals in due course. I want to shine a light on others rather than just the famous names. But let's start with the most mild-mannered, shall we? And perhaps the most capable, I would say, of those, in the form of Rowland Hill. Now, Hill has the nickname from the troops, Daddy Hill, such as his kind of affable demeanor. I think he swears on maybe 2 or 3 occasions. Usually we get through about 10 occasions of swearing just in the outtakes of the Napoleonists. So that's really quite some good going, in my opinion. Talk us through what sort of a man he was, because that reputation of being the most capable and the most mild-mannered, is it justified?
Absolutely. And speaking as someone who very rarely swears, I've always liked Hill a lot.
You are the Daddy Hill of the podcasting world. There's no question of that.
I'll take it. Hill was all of those things. And he is all of those things to the extent that sometimes you wonder, there surely must be more. Surely people think this way about him because there's just not enough written about him. But that is the truth. That is the truth. There isn't a lot written about him. There's only one sort of important biography been written about him in the last 20 years or something like that. And because of that, you don't have the wealth of discussion, endless discussion, that you have with Wellington. And as a result, he remains this sort of angelic, kindly country gentleman leading his divisions very creditably during the Peninsular War. He was an open-faced, placid-looking man who was only heard, like you say, to openly swear twice in his military service, and very mildly by today's standards as well. His care and affection for his men and those of allies and even the enemy were so universally admired and acknowledged that he was known as Daddy, which is an interesting thing, and it's probably something Jimmy Chen will turn into a t-shirt someday. But who's the daddy? I should say that was specifically a nickname given to him by the men of the 2nd Division, which was his division. And generally the rule is the nicknames come from your boys, and everybody else will, you can call him that, but that's our nickname for him. That's our thing. And he was born the son of a Shropshire gentleman. He was of the gentry. He was born in 1772. And he joined the army at a young age. He joined a line regiment. So he wasn't in the guards or anything special like that. He had a very sort of, very open-eyed view of the army because he came in at just sort of a county regiment. And interestingly enough, he then spent 2 years at a military academy in Strasbourg. So he was somewhat educated as a soldier, unusually so by most of the battalions of the line, and then saw extensive service before coming to Spain with Moore. And like you say, the trust that Wellington placed in this guy is really quite unusual when you consider the others. And based on, it's difficult to say what it's based on because he did know him a little before the war, I think, but he must have cottoned on really fast to something in Hill that made him just sort of instinctively trustable. Maybe it was that just calm, gentlemanly, good-natured, sort of roly-poly demeanor that he had that made people trust him. But unlike anybody else, or practically, this man's judgment was something that Wellington knew he could rely on.
Is that turning point perhaps Talavera, in that Hill is the one who's in command of the hill, is it called the Medellin?
Hill de Medellin.
That is the French conduct a night assault on, effectively, and Hill is in the thick of the fighting, but is instrumental in pushing the French back and ultimately thwarting that attack, which comes very close to success. And so, hey, there's nothing better than getting a result like that in early to then subsequently lead to Wellington kind of trusting the guy to get yourself out of a tight spot. Contrast that to what happens to Sherbrooke's division at Talavera, which overextends it, or a portion of it overextends itself. And he's got to plug the gap in the line with what's left of his reserves. And that's this is the squeaky buttocks moment of Talavera for him. So perhaps, do you think that's fair? Is that perhaps the root cause?
I think it tallies with the dates, because I think he would only have seen him actually fighting around Roliça, Vimiero, and Oporto before Talavera. And he'd done very credibly in all of those. Talavera, he did actually have a great test to actually hold the position. And he did that very well under rather trying circumstances. And it's notable that from 1810-11 onwards, Hill is allowed, with about 2 divisions, to go off, cover sieges, operate on his own in Estremadura, and stuff like that. So it must have been those formative years in Portugal. Wellington decided, this is the guy I can trust out of my sight. He's a hero no matter where he is, not a child when I leave him.
Yeah, I mean, we come back to that comment by Wellington, don't we? Which is, it strikes me as kind of chicken and egg scenario, that one, because if you're not prepared to give people the distance to try and do these things, they're never going to learn. And actually, sometimes you've got to make mistakes to then get it right.
It's very interesting that the theatre of war is quite small in itself. So certainly in Portugal, it would be very difficult almost to give people the room they needed. And it's interesting to ponder that thought as to whether he, in those closer confines, just decided that most of these guys can't be left alone to do stuff. Or whether it's that thing, like you said at the beginning, that I have the idea, this is my idea, and all of you are going to do it differently if I let you if I let you go. So I want to make sure you do it my way. And I'm wondering which one sort of informs the other, and how you get to this, how we could like come to some sort of determination about that, because it's true, he didn't exactly give people chances. Although now I'm thinking of a couple of instances where he did and they messed up. But that was later in the war. So rabbit hole time again. Anyway.
Yeah. Crawford may be the answer to this. We'll come back to this when we talk about the Coa. Going back to Hill for a moment, though, let's have just a dwell for a moment on his battlefield record. Because like you say, he's sort of out on a limb for a good chunk of the war. Wellington kind of handles the main theatre of operations, as is Wellington's way. And Hill gets the kind of the lesser stuff, which has attracted less attention. But he's instrumental during the Pyrenees campaign. I'm trying to remember the name of the battle off the top of my head. I want to say Sororan, but I think I may have got that wrong. When Hill has effectively had to fend off Soul's attack, Wellington arrives with reinforcements, sees that Hill has basically won, and refuses to take the command and say, no, the day is yours, finish the job. But he's also successful elsewhere. Arroyo Molinos springs to mind. So talk us through Hill on the battlefield.
Arroyo Molinos is a good example of Hill in his independent capacity, seizing an opportunity. In a way, it's an example of the guerrilla war, where Hill pounces on an exposed French division and crushes it. Lots of what Hill does between 1811 and 1812-13 is kind of what the independent partisan columns were doing, just controlling an area by movement and taking the opportunities where you can. So that's very impressive for a guy who doesn't have a sort of like a dazzling reputation for like some of Napoleon's marshals do. I think the battle you're thinking of is possibly Saint-Pierre.
It may well be.
Which Wellington said that it was the soundest thrashing the French had ever had, and I mean it's a nice tenor phrase, isn't it? Wellington thrashes the French. This goes back to the Austerlitz thing. He doesn't decisively defeat them; he just thrashes them every time they come at him, and they go away. But yes, Hill was very good at thrashing people. His battlefield record is actually very solid, and like you say, throughout the Pyrenees, he was nothing but, as usual, Hill-like. He was Hill. You could depend on him to do. Once Wellington was asked who would take over from him if he was wounded. I believe the ranking went. He was a little unsure himself. He at one point figured that it might be Sir John Hope, who was one of the lesser known chaps, but was of senior rank and seemed to be very trustworthy. Graham as well. He was very keen on Graham. He could have taken over, he said. Also, Hill. Hill was on the list as well, on the short list of the three. Hope, Hill, and Graham. Although he later also said that because Beresford was the only one who knew how to feed an army, he would probably have taken over. But that shows you kind of that he really trusted Hill with a lot, including considering him to be a possible successor should he have to leave Spain. And it's interesting as well, now I've just said Beresford, Hill almost commanded at Albuera. He got an eye infection or something. He got malaria and he had to go home. And that division that was attacking Badajoz was given to Beresford.
That could have been very different, couldn't it? Had Hill been there, or maybe not. But we've discussed.
He gave the French a thrashing at Saint Pierre, so that was Soult again.
Yeah, could have been very different. Let's talk about Hill's time as commander-in-chief, because you have this really odd situation, don't you? After Wellington resigns as C&C in order to become prime minister, something that he kind of grumbles about, having previously kind of said, well, obviously, if you're a member of the cabinet, then surely you should have to resign. So that's curious. But anyway, he does resign. So Hill takes over, and yet Wellington's premiership comes to an end, as we know, all tied up with the whole business around the Great Reform Bill. And suddenly Wellington, the person who you would expect to be C&C, isn't. And so you have this kind of gap until Hill sadly dies, at which point Wellington then takes over. I always wonder about Hill kind of being in Wellington's shadow as commander-in-chief and deferring to him far too much, sort of in Peninsular War mode. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Hill was Wellington's man. They were good friends, and he was never someone that Wellington would ever have had to worry about trying to get his job. I think that's another very important thing about Hill. His ambition was just to be a good soldier and do his job. And in Spain, that job was to do what the Duke of Wellington said. And he admired the Duke of Wellington immensely. And as a result, put these two things together, you have that sort of, I served under him in Spain, he's my commander-in-chief in more ways than one. And therefore, in a position that you come to where he's the commander-in-chief of the British Army and Duke of Wellington is prime minister, the Duke of Wellington is the Duke of Wellington. It didn't matter if he was the prime minister, to be honest. Hill would absolutely defer to Wellington. Whether or not, as Wellington's man, this deferral is as negative as has been suggested, is for someone who's more versed in what the requirements of the army were between 1850 and 1852, and whether or not those requirements demanded a level of reform that the post-Crimean fallout lets us believe was necessary. I'm not actually sure about the nuts and bolts of that. But certainly, Hill was not really his own man. He was just the man at the helm. He was man at Wellington's helm.
Yes, I think that's certainly from what I've read, that seems to be fair. If folks are interested in visiting Hill's grave, it is underneath Westminster Abbey, which was quite a kind of surprising little discovery when I stumbled across the little thing embedded in the floor. He's off in the corner, sort of to the back left of the altar. Look for him, he's there. But then, like so many in Westminster Abbey, you're almost sort of tripping over people. Literally, I mean, they're kind of buried underneath the floor, and you kind of pass people without even noticing. We should move on to discuss other commanders, though. Picton springs to mind next, marked contrast to Hill. You're almost talking chalk and cheese here, aren't you?
Mm.
A bullish individual, unquestionably brave, but as has become much more widely aware, much more widely known, a deeply controversial individual, given his support of slavery, and then, depending on where you think the significance lies, also particularly for his role in sanctioning the torture of a mulatto girl. And just for folks who aren't aware, am I right in saying that, because I don't want to brush that aside, this is an important aspect, not least in showing the two sides of the man, and the fact that actually you can have two deeply kind of conflicting things in terms of what we want to emphasize in terms of personal virtues embedded in the same individual. He escapes that prosecution for the torture. Well, initially, actually, he is prosecuted, then he escapes on a technicality, if I'm right in saying, and I think that technicality is that it's a Spanish colony. Spanish law technically permitted what he did, and so therefore he acted within the law that was in effect in the colony at the time. Is that the legal gymnastics that plays out?
That's the legal gymnastics that I'm aware of, yes. He tortured about a 14 or 15-year-old girl who was suspected as having aided and abetted in a robbery. Her name was Luisa Calderon, who gave evidence against him in the first trial, which was before the King's Bench in 1806. And in that trial, he used the defense, like you say, Spanish law, Spanish colony. I was given orders by General Abercrombie to govern Tobago along these lines at this moment, with the added addendum that also martial law is in force, which is also why the Privy Council, he was up before the Privy Council as well for unnecessary cruelty towards the enslaved population and controlling the population as it was. And they were very, very worried about the idea that he had gone around shooting people out of hand, which apparently he had. And this one where he picketed her, which is a curious torture where you tie someone to a yoke and have them suspended so they can only, I believe, put the weight of one toe on the ground, and you do that day after day until they break, is a very unusual form of torture to begin with, and one that he said he was allowed to inflict because of Spanish law. The opposition lawyers made the point that there is actually nothing in the law relevant to the colonies that you can torture people. And that was why he was convicted in the first one. But through a technicality, and I don't know what the technicality was, he managed to get a retrial where he presented evidence showing that although, in the colonies, it doesn't say you're allowed to torture people, Spanish law clearly says you can, and here are all the evidences that show that they did torture people. And so what happened was they overturned the guilty verdict, but then asked the question, which was, I think, rather pertinent. As a British subject who knows that it is illegal by British law to torture a free person, how on earth did you think that this was a good idea? And then the court, realizing that things had swung around to almost a completely new trial, they basically dismissed Picton so they could redeliberate, and they never reconvened.
Yeah, I mean, it's important for people to realize that this is not a period where law is concrete. I mean, yes, even to this day, there is interpretation of law anyway. That's why you get judicial reviews of things. But the way in which law operates in different regions is very fluid. And when you go out to the colonies, it's even more fluid, because we're talking about martial law, resisting the temptation to go too far down the military discipline line. But the army has its own military codes of military law, which are actually inferior to British civilian law, but they're also inferior to any other type of civilian law. So you have a situation where if you're in the colonies, your last resort is to apply the military codes of punishment to the wider population. You should always take preference, give precedence to other nations' jurisdictions. Well, then you're dealing with another entirely different legal code, and it gets very messy. And that's why you get situations like this, where somebody who has clearly been a git, to put it really quite flippantly and mildly, is able to get away with something like this. Picton, I don't know if if it's fair to say that it's a contradiction, but on the one hand, you've got that, and that's a very key part of Picton. And the other side is that he's incredibly brave. But I'm not quite done with Picton being a git, if I'm being honest with you, because he doesn't always have the greatest relationship with his troops, does he? And I'm thinking here quite obviously of the Connaught Rangers, where he turns around and describes them as the Connaught footpads, a man who was not afraid to use the lash, who, in contrast to Hill, did like to use an expletive when he felt it necessary, which was not considered genteel behavior, but was the nature of the man. So what kind of a commander was he?
In the British Army, there was a breed of officer that could be said to be of the regimental stamp. And Thomas Picton, who was born into a Welsh gentry family in 1758, and it was an ensign at 13, could be said to be one of them. Picton would remember the days of wide uniform facings and long tails, queued hair, and white gaiters and things like that, and white powdered hair even. And he had experience in Prussian service, which is probably where he gets his disciplinary streak from, because he was on half pay and he traveled around a bit. And so that probably explains quite a lot. This is a very 18th century, mid 18th century minded guy. And
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Planning for your next trip? Elevate your travel style with Quince. Quince has all the jet-setting essentials you'll want for your next getaway, like European linen, premium luggage options, buttery soft Italian leather bags, and so much more. And it's all priced at 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Plus, Quince only works with factories that use safe and ethical manufacturing practices. Pack your bags with high-quality essentials you'll be wearing for vacations to come with Quince. Go to quince.com/trip for free shipping and 365-day returns.
also, he was very tactically aggressive as a commander. He was one of those guys that we were saying at the beginning, not terribly strategically brilliant. He was an okay organizer. He could get a division to where it needed to go, but he was very tactically aggressive, and he was very good at understanding the tempo of a battle and timing and things like that. And that's what you need in terms of tactics. So in that sense, he was a good battlefield commander. But he wasn't a commander who was going to get much sympathy from his troops or much love from them, because he was one of those types of commanders, a Prussian type commander, you might call him. Probably anachronistic to use that phrase, because not all Prussian commanders were savages or anything like that. But he was also a very curious bird who liked to dress in civilian clothes, which had a weird effect of slightly endearing him to the troops who knew what sort of a man he was. At Busaco, he commanded his division with a sleeping cap still on his head. And he was personally, like you say, very brave. He was wounded at Badajoz and was a critical force at Vitoria, roaring into action, damning his men from there to tomorrow. However, I believe it was during Soult's counteroffensive in the Pyrenees where he and I think Cope ended up being bundled back by Soult, much to Wellington's anger. And this is again sort of proving the Dukes their heroes and children at the same time. Picton is a very good example of that for Wellington. He's a hero when Wellington is there to tell him what to do and to put him where he needs to be. But generally speaking, he's a bit of a loose cannon and will get probably bogged down in minutiae and probably end up quite indecisive strategically if you let him out of sight of someone like Wellington. So I think Wellington valued greatly his ability to fight and get a division moving like at Vitoria, and really swinging that battle in favor of the Allies decisively. But generally speaking, he's not one of the top rank overall commanders like Hill or even Graham. Graham's a very interesting guy, which we'll get to later. But I think that's Picton.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Picton is not somebody who you can see succeeding Wellington by any stretch of the imagination. You'd almost take Picton out of the theatre before you let him take over. I'm very struck by, and I'm now trying to remember who said it, this common thing that we perhaps quite often discuss when we're talking about commanders, which is that the rank and file considered there to be two types, the come-ons and the go-ons. And the difference, of course, being that the go-ons are the people who are quite prepared to sit at the back and let other people put themselves in harm's way, and you give the orders, go on, you go over there, whilst I stay here and stay safe and within the confines of how safe you can be in a 19th century battle, but not really in the thick of it. Now, Wellington's not one of those. He's always in the thick of the fighting. The men know that. Crawford, as we'll come on to discuss in a moment, is a come-on type of commander. So is Picton. And this is probably why Picton ends up being wounded a number of times. You've mentioned Badajoz, where, am I right in saying he scales the walls with his division?
He was definitely in the he was definitely down at the glacis for certain. I don't know if he actually got on the walls, but he was wounded because he was with them. And that's an insane thing. And then at Quatre Bras, this is the famous one that we tend to talk about. Yes, sure, he's killed at Waterloo. Bullet to the forehead. He's wearing a top hat, that civilian clothing thing that you were talking about earlier. But at Quatre Bras, he was actually wounded. He received a bullet to the groin, which, bearing in mind, these are commanders who ride on horseback. That's particularly, all wounds are painful, obviously, but that's going to be a particularly difficult wound to deal with. Yet he decides to conceal it because effectively he knew Wellington needed him to stay at his post. Which gives you a kind of a sense of, this is why I come back to what extent is this a contradiction. I don't think it is necessarily a contradiction, but it is something that takes a lot of kind of getting your head around, that on the one hand, he can be quite a deplorable human being, and yet on the other hand, demonstrates something that we've always held in high esteem in society, which is an incredibly brave individual with a clear sense of duty and willing to put himself and his personal well-being second in order to fulfill that duty. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is one of those things, and of course, to be a good soldier, you don't necessarily have to be a good person. And for the
True.
Peninsular Army, they may well have actually liked Picton, despite the fact that he whipped them and swore at them, because they kind of saw some of the lower ranks' grit in him. They could see in him that he was willing to share their dangers, and quite happily spoke to them in a language they understood. So you do have that strange sort of contradiction in Picton, and with Waterloo, it reminds me of an interesting thing, however, is that we shouldn't go too far the other way into thinking he was terribly beloved, because after hiding the wound he received at Quatre Bras, which some people say was a cannonball, and
No.
that means it was this is the thing, if it was a cannonball, then it was the contusions caused by the passing of the ball.
So what it would have passed near him.
Yeah, what the French call the vent de boulet. So it was known to knock people off their feet, rupture blood vessels, cause massive bruising. The displacement of the air around it basically causes the wound. And but I've read that it was a cannonball in one place, which seems insane. But but it's possible. Point is, he was wounded at Quatre Bras and it covered it up. Then he gets to Waterloo, and his last words are "Charge, boys, hurrah, hurrah!" And he dies by a bullet to the head, and he is immediately robbed. A soldier falls out of the line to try and pick his pocket. No one would do that to Hill.
Yeah, that's a fair point, actually. I mean, I was about to turn around and say, slightly flippantly, that's, Wellington's scum of the earth for you, isn't it? This is what the rank and file do like to do. And hey, senior general, he's going to have plenty in his pockets. But yeah, that is a point, that actually would Hill's men have done the equivalent?
They wouldn't, because his horse went down during the end of the Battle of Waterloo, and everybody was horrified because they thought he was dead.
Interesting. I didn't know that. That's an interesting point of comparison, isn't it? Let's keep the momentum going. So from one disciplinarian to another famous name, Robert Crawford, Black Bob Crawford, as he's known in some circles. Huge reputation for fierceness. Marcus recently said, yeah, Crawford, he's one of yours, isn't he? He's a flogger. I think Marcus thinks I have some great affection for people who use the whip. That's not the case, I hasten to add in my defense. Crawford, what's he like as a leader? That's a deep question, isn't it?
It is a deep question, but I think he was a very good leader. I think he is a standout leader, was Crawford. During the retreat to Vigo, which is the parallel thing from Coruña, which Crawford was in charge of, one rifleman wrote of him that he seemed to have been created to command in times of dire crisis. He'd lock you away for falling out of formation, right? To get some water. He'd put you on charge. He'd bawl you out for deviating around a flooded part of the road. He'd flogged and went up in the blue light. But he was a brilliant field commander, and he knew how to lead. And it was probably only his bitterness at being held over for higher command that held him back from greatness and his temper. He was certainly very tactically gifted, and to be honest, I don't think it would be too egregious to say that he became a legend within the army while he was there. And he was a very complicated guy. I really wish I had, by this point, read the new book about him, which has supposedly got a lot of new stuff. But from what I know of him right now, he was a very impressive leader. You had to be to run the light division.
That's absolutely true. For folks who aren't familiar, Ian Fletcher has written, I'm almost tempted to say it looks like he's done a Muir, in the sense that he's written this doorstopper of a book, rather like Rory Muir's 2-volume biography of Wellington. And I've received it. I haven't, I'm ashamed to say, had the opportunity to go through it yet, because it is such a detailed read. So I'm very interested to see what he's turned up there, because that could be really quite something. Yes, Crawford, he's a funny one, isn't he? Because he, as you say, he had that inclination to turn around and take you to task for seemingly quite small things, deviating from a puddle, and then he'd give you a lecture on how that would slow down the advance of an army, which was therefore detrimental to the army's objects. And yet, isn't it Crawford who, when he sees an officer being carried by a member of the rank and file across a river, bellows at the guy, "You will put that man down at once," to the member of the rank and file. And so the officer gets dunked in the river, because Crawford has this sense of how officers should conduct themselves. And so this officer, who thinks he's going to keep his feet dry all the way across this river, ends up being dropped wholesale into the deepest part of the river, and Crawford makes him walk back across the river to the bank and then recross the river. So again, it gives you a measure of the guy, that he has expectations of everybody. This isn't just a keep the rank and file in check. It's you conduct yourself in a certain way, and if you fail to meet those exacting standards, I will take you to task for it, which makes him quite a difficult person in so many respects.
I think Crawford, in a way, suffered from being too educated in a military sense. He was another one of these people who had actually been in the army quite a while. He'd been to I think he had been to a military academy, and he had served in other I think he'd served in foreign units, possibly in Hanover, and he had vast experience of how things are supposed to be done, and he was involved in the training of the light infantry to some extent, or at least was known to Moore enough that he entrusted the light brigade to him. He was one of the most professional officers in the army by the time of the Peninsular War, in terms of his understanding and experience, and that built in him this kind of, this is how things are supposed to work, right? If you are carrying an officer across the river, he's not doing his job, you're not doing your job, efficiency is going down, and we're all going to die. So you drop that man, and we'll teach you both a lesson. You'll be flogged, and he will get all the stuff wet. So this Crawford there's tons of stories like that about Crawford, and they all build this picture of, like I say, a very complicated individual as a human being and as a commander.
Yeah, I mean, we have to talk about, so we've talked about how he's a come-on style of commander. He's very poised at battles such as Busaco. He's killed in the breaches at Ciudad Rodrigo because he placed himself in the thick of the fighting. At Busaco, he is the one who's standing there watching the French come up that hill, timing to perfection that moment where he orders his men to stand and unleash the volley and charge.
Avenge the death of Sir John Moore.
Precisely. In fact, they might have not even fired. They might have just gone straight in with the bayonets. I can't remember, which is shameful. But it gives you a sense of this guy. He knows how to lead in the thick of the fighting, but also is inclined to place himself in the thick of the fighting in order to be able to use that knowledge to maximum effect. But there is that incident where it all goes rather wrong for him, which is the Curran. We've sort of skirted around the edges of this already, and you were saying that you were kind of scratching your head about why is it that Wellington, at what point does Wellington have this sense that I can't trust these men? I wonder if the Coa is the genesis of that. And the reason I'm thinking this is that Crawford has almost this kind of semi-independent status up until that point. So give folks a sense, before I start disappearing off down rabbit holes again, give folks a sense of the issue at the Coa and what Wellington's beef, if you like, is.
Well, at the Coa, you have this strange incident of Crawford, who up to that point has been doing a fabulous job of guarding this frontier against Ney, I believe. And On this particular day, he lets his guard down. He has somehow managed to allow himself to encamp with no easy line of retreat and is not aware of what the French are doing. And Ney launches a surprise attack on his camp at the car and surprises it completely, drives it all the way back towards this narrow bridge over a teetering gorge. And it looks like everybody's going to get killed, or they're all going to have to surrender, and half of the brigade or division. Is it a division yet, or is it a brigade?
Might be a division by this point.
Might be a division, yeah. Well, anyway, he could lose half of the division easily in this, and it's only because the light division is the light division that it manages to rally and puts up a fight, and they manage to scramble back across the bridge, and then they hold the high ground behind the bridge until nightfall. But it's an outright defeat, and one that up until that point Crawford had been able to avoid by just being on top of everything. And so for the light division, which is supposed to be the screening force of the entire army, to get surprised like this by the French is something that Wellington is at first very angry about, because it's in, and reasonably speaking, Wellington's right, it's incompetence that allows it to happen. Crawford lets his guard down. He doesn't keep a good enough eye on the French, and has selected for himself a place to encamp that is predicated basically on his idea that he's safe. And so at first Wellington's absolutely furious about it, although he does forgive Crawford, because I think Crawford manages to explain some logical reasons why it happened. It's always an accident. It's always an accident whenever these things happen. And Wellington was generally all right. Well, accidents happen, but let's not have this thing happen too many more times, shall we? That's why Wellington's angry, because basically Ney beats him up.
Yeah, I mean, there's that famous exchange, isn't there, between them, where Crawford and Wellington meet, and Wellington says that, I'm pleased to see that you're safe, and Crawford goes, "Oh, I was in no danger," and Wellington, classic Wellington, turns around with "You may not have been, but I most certainly was," and Crawford goes away, sort of saying he's damned crusty this morning. But it gives you that sense of Wellington's fear, to lose such a proportion of his army at that point in the campaign. This is 1810. This is the prelude to what becomes the third French invasion of Portugal. He's got to take Wellington knows he's got to take the army all the way back to Torres Vedras. Well, if he can't stop the French before that point, he's got to take it all the way back to Torres Vedras. So to lose that portion of his army, the shockwaves that could have sent through the government back home as well, that could have been huge. Crawford, I want to be nice to Crawford as we kind of wrap up on him, because yes, he screwed up on occasions. We've also talked about how on plenty of occasions he got it right. See Basarco. See also who is sent in at Fuente Don Nuro to rescue the situation. When Wellington gets it wrong, he sends in the light division, and boy, does Crawford save his bacon. The whole division saves his bacon.
Yeah, Fuentes is basically him just flexing to show that yes, Kerr was an anomaly. This is what I can do. I will take on the entire French army, and I will get the 7th Division back.
And it is deeply impressive. But what's really curious about Crawford is the contradiction of his character. He has this reputation of being a ferocious individual, but he was also a very tender family man. He actually takes leave on one occasion because he just needs to go home and see his wife. It's as simple as that. He needs to go home to spend time with his family. How does that play out as somebody who just kind of struggles to get their head around these sorts of things?
He was to be honest, he was like I say, this is one of the reasons why he's a very complicated individual, one of the most fascinating individuals for that, and very tragic for the way he sadly died. He was prone to episodes of this sort of hopeless, bottomless depression that could only be solved by writing and receiving letters from his wife, or in some cases actually literally going to see her. And so that level of devotion is telling in comparison to some other stories you hear about less harsh generals, we'll say, that this guy who would happily flog anybody for minor problems could become so depressed that he had to go back home to see his family is fascinating. But it's not exactly as if that his troops hated him either particularly. A sort of respect was born in his fairness, to be honest. He always had a reason for inflicting punishment and discipline. He didn't do it because he liked cruelty. He did it because he thought it was best for the efficient running of the division. And I think this is borne out by the fact that when he died, and as you say, he was buried in the breach at Ciudad Rodrigo, onlookers watched as the pallbearers marched carrying the coffin down the track to the grave, and on approaching a large, deep, flooded puddle in their way, they plunged right through it without a stop. And veterans of the Light Division would have said, old Black Bob would have wanted it that way. And so, again, I don't think if he'd have, nobody was robbing Crawford when he fell.
Yeah, there's a mark of respect there, isn't there? Again, no, let's not go down that line, because that will be a deep crime and punishment conversation. And boy, have we done that to death already. There are so many others that we could go on to talk about, aren't there? Pakenham really springs to mind. Wellington's brother-in-law led the 3rd Division in that devastatingly successful attack at Salamanca, but whose career was not only ended by the Battle of New Orleans, where he's killed, but has also been overshadowed by that battle because it doesn't go particularly well. So how much did Pakenham owe to being Wellington's brother-in-law, and how much was down to genuine talent?
Well, as we've said before, and I think we've said in other episodes, the British Army exists at this time because of who you know. You move on in the British Army because who you know. You can't escape the cronyism. Wellington had it. He had a very influential brother, and it's expected that you pass it on. If you get there, you pass it on down the line. You help others. So I don't think it can be discounted that Pakenham was benefited by having Wellington as his brother-in-law. However, strangely enough, actually, it is backed up by a fair degree of talent. If you look at what his record is like. Now, Pakenham shows up at Salamanca, and generally that's the first and last time we hear about him until he gets killed. But Wellington praised that attack very highly, and he said very few of his generals could have done it, going so far to say that, partiality aside, and he was very fond of Edward Pakenham, that he is one of the best we have, and that's a quote. And up until that time, Pakenham had actually been dotting around between brigade command and fairly senior staff positions, as you might expect with his connections. But he didn't like staff work. And again, he showed great attacking flair in the Pyrenees. So he certainly had some actual talent to back up the connections. And obviously that's something that Wellington liked a lot.
Okay, so New Orleans. What goes wrong? I always think about it and wonder whether the attack was really necessary, but we know that the war was about to end. It's a bit like a Toulouse for Wellington in that regard. And it's important to set that hindsight aside. So enlighten us.
Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, all wars in the age before instant communications have a delayed ending. And New Orleans is an example of that. It achieved nothing towards the resolution of the war. all it really did was allow Andrew Jackson to one day become president, and for that reason in itself, it should be a great disaster for everybody involved. But what went wrong, militarily speaking, was that Pakenham got into one of those situations where, as an aggressive commander, he's placed himself in a crisis situation, and he winds up seeing no way out of it except to fight. The attack was, unlike his other offensive work, a shambles. It was uncoordinated, indecisive, badly prepared for. Pakenham compounded these errors by exposing himself to the unchecked fire from the American breastworks that could not be suppressed by either musketry or artillery. The real tragedy for the British is that the American defences could have been turned, and indeed were turned by Royal Marines, who would, and this would have probably forced Jackson to abandon the position if this had gone ahead in conjunction with a more orderly attack. Timings went wrong. The ladders weren't long enough. The ladders weren't ready to be moved forward. Part of the line went forward, part of the line stopped. The loss of control over a surprisingly small battlefield is quite startling, and the Americans just shot them to pieces. And it seemed to get so out of control so fast, and then he got hit at least twice, that everything broke down. So I think it's a question, I think it highlights basically that it really highlights how good commanders like Graham and Hill and people that Wellington trusted out of his sight, it really highlights their skill and how difficult it is to be a general and to win battles. It's not as simple as it looks, basically. Pakenham did have a good record. He was probably in the minds of the British Army, he was probably thought to be quite suitable for fighting in America because of his good offensive spirit. But it all untangled itself in the difficulties of trying to attack New Orleans.
I think another that we have to talk about is Graham, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The victor of Barossa, we have talked about Barossa in the past. We've talked about how he was a likely successor to Wellington. I find Graham's trajectory really interesting because he was actually deeply Francophile until his wife died and her body was treated disgracefully by the French as he was trying to bring her back to burial. I think customs officers basically broke open her coffin to confirm that there was no contraband inside. And that was what turned him against specifically the revolution. So talk us through his rise to prominence.
Thomas Graham is another one of those fascinating guys. He's sort of the weird example of that it's never too late, basically. He was much older than you usually are when you begin military service. He'd been born in 1748, and he was like the third son of the Laird of Balgowan in Perthshire. And he was educated at Christ Church in Oxford, married his Gainsborough beauty, Mary Cathcart, and he'd basically been contented to be a country gentleman and a family man until his wife died in 1792, and like you say, very tragically was desecrated, essentially, at a customs booth. And in 1793, Graham, fuming and just desperate to basically avenge this terrible insult, he had got himself onto the staff of Lord Mulgrave, an ADC, pretty old ADC, and took part in the operation at Toulon, where he met a chap called Rowland Hill.
Oh.
And he was so filled with a wish to bring his own torment to the Republic of France that he raised the 90th foot at his own expense and became a provisional lieutenant colonel in 1794, setting up Hill as his major, and Hill pretty much made that battalion a very fine one. Weirdly, he ended up as a military commissioner to the Austrians during Napoleon's first Italian campaign, and had a few notable adventures, such as escaping from Mantua and taking messages to the Austrians from the besieged city. And after Amiens, he was accompanied he accompanied, sorry, as he was still only semi-officially a lieutenant colonel, Moore to Corunna, where after Moore's death, apparently at Moore's request, he was confirmed with backdated seniority as lieutenant colonel.
We have to talk about Barossa just briefly. I know we've talked about it to a degree before, especially with regards to the French commander Victor. How much of the victory is down to Graham? I mean, he's not, as you kind of alluded to, he's not somebody with years of experience, and yet he is commanding in what becomes a kind of surprise defeat for the French. You know, it should have been a pretty simple action, ends up being quite hard fought. But how much of the victory is down to Graham, and how much of it is down to just sheer bloody mindedness on the part of British troops?
I think it's a bit of both, to be honest. It's difficult to quantify which is more important. Graham makes the right call from an instinctive place, I guess, in that he chooses to continue the fight at the right time, rather than just trying to get out of there and being cut to pieces as he does. Instead, he goes back and attacks, which the French aren't prepared for. He, however, has the bonus of having the British infantry with him. And the British infantry have the reputation that they're such a solid force that if you even have a mediocre general with basically good instincts, they will win the battle for you. You just need to give them the right options. And Graham gave them the right options, and they won the battle for him.
Yeah, that's again, I'm so tempted to go to. I'm having to resist kind of going off on one about morale and motivation and the British rank and file during this period. But that is a common thing, isn't it? That they do emphatically believe in themselves, and it goes back to Albuera. You know, that thing of not really knowing when you're beaten and just going, no, we are not going anywhere, and fighting on. And that quite often ends up being something that becomes a turning point until you inflict sufficient attrition on your enemy to then break them in turn. How does Graham, though, compare to the others? He commands at San Sebastian. That obviously takes 2 attempts. We know that Wellington doesn't do sieges particularly well, but San Sebastian's quite different to, Ciudad Rodrigo, Badajoz, Burgos. It's a coastal fortress. You can basically only get in on one side. Ultimately, the place does fall. So is it unfair to use San Sebastian as a measuring stick for his ability?
It's an interesting question. I mean, Wellington trusted him like no other general except Hill. He gave him a slightly less leeway than Hill, because he understood that he was not as solid in his judgment, but he was given quite a lot of opportunity for independent action, although always carrying out, I think it's fair to say he was always carrying out some sort of general intention, like early in the Vittoria campaign. I actually think that Graham, who, as I've said before, is a really interesting guy, represents a rare thing in Wellington's army, who is the strategic general. And he excelled operationally rather than tactically. San Sebastian saw his innovative use of supporting artillery fire over the heads of his men to ensure they could get into the breach. That is a tactical decision, but it's at a somewhat different level. And this is also borne out by the fact that his performance of Vittoria is middling compared to Picton's, say. And he failed quite badly at Bergen op Zoom in 1814. So it's obvious that for a guy who became a major general at 50, he was doing an impressive job, but there are limits to that capability. And where it's never in doubt is when he's ordered to do a large strategic mission, such as his drive to lever the French out of continuing positions during the Vittoria campaign. And so where does he rank amongst generals? Amongst Wellington's generals? Probably quite high. Because Wellington's generals never fought particularly their own battles on their own. You only have Hill and Beresford to compare him to, really. And as a result, he sits probably somewhat above Beresford as a result and below Hill.
And that's no insignificant place to be, above Beresford, below Hill. That is, a sign that you're capable. I like what you say there. It's worth emphasizing just how significant that decision at San Sebastian was, because without it, they weren't getting anywhere near that breach. They genuinely weren't. Getting into San Sebastian, when you look at it, you almost wonder how they managed it. It almost looks impossible to get into, such as you've literally only got one side, which means that everything is concentrated in that one area. It's the perfect place to defend.
So again, like at Barassi, he's making the right tactical decisions quite a lot, and that's a very it's a very important thing. Like Napoleon said, sometimes luck helps, but it's also making the right calls.
There are so many more that we could also talk about. Sherbrooke springs to mind, Von Alton. There are also those who were Wellington's subordinates who weren't divisional commanders, but he was very close to. I'm thinking here of his protege, Charles Cox, who's killed at Burgos. You've got Miguel de Alava, who frankly deserves an episode in his own right. Who would you say is the most underrated individual? Not necessarily divisional commander, but you can go for divisional commander if you want. Who's the most underrated person under his command?
Well, there's a question and a half for you. I'm torn. Okay. There is another elephant in the room here. And I think, to be honest, it has to be him, although I almost chose another guy. I'll tell you who my second choice was. And he is Sir Stapleton Cotton, who is... He was an excellent cavalry commander. Wellington, with typical reserve, said he commands our cavalry well. And that was all Wellington wanted from a cavalry commander, overseeing something as delicate as the British mounted arm. Cotton was a dandy, excellent horseman, superbly brave, controversial in that he was a slave owner, like Picton, but known as the Lion d'Or, the Golden Lion, for his fantastic hussar uniforms, up with something stupid like 500 guineas and such like that. But he was never a parade ground fop, and he preferred his troops to be comfortable rather than like he was. And he won battles at Villa Garcia. And let's not forget that he was in command of the cavalry at Salamanca. Le Marchant takes all the credit somehow, but he was Cotton's brigadier, not the other way around. Wellington rode up to Cotton afterwards and said, "The day is your own." And Cotton was in the Peninsular War almost as much as Wellington was. He only had one short break. And when he was shot by a Portuguese sentry after Salamanca by accident, and he was in all the major campaigns, and that says something about his capability and his quality as an officer. And he's very unsung compared to, say, Uxbridge. But I have to say, although as tempted as I am to go cavalry and say it's Cotton, it's actually probably George Murray.
Good one. Yes. Okay. Explain for folks who aren't familiar.
Well, for a start, let's just blanket this by saying without Murray, nothing happens in the Peninsular Army. He is Wellington's quartermaster general. He is the man who makes everything happen. Wellington thinks he makes everything happen, or everybody thinks that Wellington makes everything happen. Wellington gives the directive, and then George Murray has to figure out how to make it happen. He has to figure out how to. Wellington says, "Take that town." Okay, how many roads are there to that town? How many places are there to camp on the way to that town? Where are the French in relation to that town? And how long will it take for the baggage train to get there? How then you have to organize the people with the letters riding to the different divisions with the maps to show them the way to that town. Then this is staff work. He is the chief of staff of the Peninsular Army, and he's Wellington's chief of staff. Think about that. Okay, that alone should explain why this guy is the unsung hero of the Peninsular Army. Likewise, it's not like he's unknown. A lot of people share this view, especially in recent years. But he's still not terribly well known, and unlike combat commanders, he doesn't have the glamour of leading troops in action. He sees battle all the time and things like that. But yeah, I think it has to be George Murray.
Yeah, Wellington's effective chief of staff. That is a fair point. But just to play devil's advocate and be difficult for the sake of being difficult, because hey, it's me and this is what I love to do with you. Just to push you that little bit harder. To be chief of staff to Wellington, the great micromanager of the age, frankly, was that something that perhaps made it a little bit easier in that, Wellington's there with enough of an eye on the detail that he's talking about the proportion of oats in the feed that the horses are receiving and things. And so therefore, Wellington might say, we're advancing on Vittoria, we're advancing on Villafranca, whatever it might be. But actually, Wellington's got a pretty good idea. I want 3rd Division here. I want 1st Division leading the way. I want 7th Division in reserve, etc.
Sure. Those are all tactical and strategic considerations. Murray's not going to touch any of them. The order in which divisions march and things are mostly down to Wellington. And of course, Wellington was ridiculously in tune with the logistics of how the army moves and stuff, but he also knew that he couldn't do everything. And so he needed an able deputy who could do all of the things he wanted him to do and more. And think about it this way. Yeah, having a boss like Wellington means that it's slightly easier on paperwork, but he's also looking over your shoulder all the time. Okay.
That is fair. And it's a nice moment to end on, actually, because it touches a theme that we've alluded to the whole way through this about Wellington, the micromanager. Josh, it's always a pleasure to have you on the Napoleon Assist. Bullocks, grain and good Madeira. It's not connected to the Peninsula War. It's to do with the campaign out in India, the Second Maratha War, and the Jat campaigns. It's well worth a read. I know I've plugged it before on this podcast a number of times. I make no apologies for doing it again, folks. You can get it from hellion.co.uk or from the Napoleon Assist bookstore. You can follow Josh on Twitter at, is it at Adventures in Historyland? No, it's at Land of History.
Land of History, where the nickname comes from.
At Land of History. But he's under Adventures in Historyland. Give him a follow. Josh, absolute delight. Thank you so, so much.
Always delighted to come back. Thank you very much.
If you've been inspired to read further into the ideas raised in this episode, don't rush off to Amazon. I have an alternative suggestion. Why not support independent bookstores and your boy producing this podcast by buying them via the Napoleon Assist bookshop? Click the link in the description and you'll find a vast range of titles that will be of interest, all arranged by theme, and in the process independent booksellers get a cut and the Napoleon Assist gets a cut, so there are many who benefit. Do remember to leave a like and review, and as you know I always thank my Patreon supporters, but have good news for those who don't want to make a regular contribution, but do want to leave a one-off tip. You can now tip the Napoleon Assist on Ko-fi, the link is in the description, and know in advance that your generosity, whatever the size of the tip, is hugely appreciated. And of course, no episode would be complete without a shout out to my Patreon supporters, who keep the podcast going through their subscriptions. There are some exclusive perks, including discount codes for Pen and Sword, voting rights, and even bespoke one-to-ones with me, so be sure to check out the link in the description for more details. A particular thanks to my Emperor-level patron, Mark Stouse, my Commander patrons, Ger Brown and Jane Davis, and my mentioned in Dispatches patrons, Colin Fieldhouse, Ryan Diamond, Alexandra Lyon, Josh Keeney, Gareth Copeland, Ross Flowers, Jim Deary, Lucy Tatner, James Bevan, Roy Muir, Lynn Dawson, Beatrice de Graaf, Anna Vakulenko, John Haynes, Brendan Teeling, an anonymous Canadian, Alex Churchill, and Rob Griffith. I will be back in just a few days' time as Wellington month continues to ramp up as it reaches its climax. But until then, I'm Zach White. This has been The Napoleonicist. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.
Thank you.